Okay, dann mein Ton ist im Zoom auch an, ne? Tipptopp. Dann fangen wir heute mal überpünktlich an. Hallo, willkommen zurück zur Ringvorlesung. Ich bin Coco, keine Pronomen. Und schön, dass ihr noch in Präsenz da seid. Schön, dass alle, die im Zoom da sind, auch da sind. Und ganz liebe Grüße natürlich auch an alle, die es auf YouTube nachschauen. Das ist ja die Großzahl, würde ich denken. Heute habe ich nur eine ganz kurze organisatorische Ankündigung für euch. Der zweite Online-Test hat ja letzte Woche geendet und wir wurden auf einen Fehler aufmerksam gemacht, den wir gemacht haben. Also in der Frage Transformationspfade des Norddeutschen Reallabors war da ein Problem mit so der Reduzierung der Treibhausgasemissionen in Norddeutschland in so einem bestimmten Zeitraum. Da gibt es mehrere richtige Antworten. Wir haben nur eine als richtig gewertet. Das heißt, wir können nicht 3000 Tests manuell durchgehen, schaffen wir leider nicht. Deswegen sollten euch am Ende des Semesters 2 Punkte zum Bestehen fehlen und ihr habt das Gefühl, naja, eigentlich habe ich diese Frage ja richtig beantwortet. Schreibt uns gerne eine Mail und dann checken wir einmal manuell, ob ihr es vielleicht doch geschafft habt und das Modul bestanden habt. Also es wird für die wenigsten der Fall sein. Wir möchten es aber hier einmal trotzdem ansagen. Genau, das war's auch schon von mir. So I'll switch to English now and introduce our guest today, Esteban Servat. Esteban is a biologist that grew up in Argentina. He's worked in biotech in Silicon Valley for 10 years, an industry which he now criticizes as being too technocratic, as I've read. And then he actually went back to Argentina to build an eco-village in the desert in the region of Mendoza. That is a place where water usage is particularly politicized, I would say. And after he heard of the governmental plans on fracking in the area, Esteban co-founded EcoLeaks, actually, to inform the fellow citizens about the secrecy around environmental destruction in the area. So due to heavy political repression, he then had to flee to Germany in 2018. We're very happy to have you here, but of course for sad reasons. And he continues his fight against fracking and the usage of liquid natural gas. All the way from Berlin, welcome Esteban. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Cornelius. Thank you all for having me, for coming so close to Christmas at the end of the year. It's great to be with you. And what I will tell you today is a combination of stories of resistance, stories of destruction, but also stories of hope and building power, which I think is what we all need to do if we want to have a chance at achieving anything in this climate fight that is getting so much out of hand and out of control for us. So as Cornelius was telling you, I come from Argentina. I was not an activist. I was a scientist by training. I lived in the US for 10 years in the heart of the monster, the heart of the Silicon Valley, working for some of the world's biggest biopharmaceutical companies, developing vaccines. That was quite an experience. And then I came back to Argentina with 2 goals. One was to help build a company that would be mostly state-owned, that would be focusing on developing solutions for neglected tropical diseases. We have in the global south, there is a lot of diseases that are neglected by the biopharmaceutical industry. And I found that as a scientist, that should be my role, to help develop the tools and solutions that we are missing. We have a lot of diseases that are deeply connected with poverty. So you get sick and you stay poor, and you are poor and you get sick. So it's a cycle of poverty and illness that I thought I could contribute to fixing. And that's a long story that is not part of this presentation, but we got quite far into building that company. But because of corruption and the election of a right-wing government in Argentina, all of that was frozen in 2015. And then I moved to the countryside to start another project, which is just some of the focus of this, which is a self-sustainable community, an eco-village, something more simple, less technical and less political, where we were building eco homes and just trying to reduce our own carbon footprint by using organic agriculture and sustainable energy and things like that. And those were happy years as far as we knew. But then fracking came. And fracking was introduced by the government in the area where I was living, which is called Mendoza. I don't know if you can see the mouse. No, you cannot see the mouse here. But that's Argentina. Mendoza is part of this basin called Vaca Muerta. And this is something that if you're interested in the environment, in the climate, you really should know about, because it's one of the world's biggest gas, and oil basins. But it's not just that. It's also unconventional basin, shale, which means that in order to extract this oil and gas, you need to use fracking, a technique that is extremely contaminating, that is a really good example of how far humanity, people are willing to go for greed and to really scrape the end of the pot for oil and gas up until the last drop. And in the process, sacrificing communities like ours and sacrificing the future of all of you, because fracking is the leading cause of methane emissions, as I am going to show you. So because of all of that, fracking was introduced in our province, and we were unlucky enough to be part of this, to be sitting on top of the world's second largest shale gas basin, called Vaca Muerta. It's about the size of Belgium, and it's a carbon bomb for the planet, a carbon bomb that there is plenty of in the global south, but it's being exploited by companies from here. The leading corporations destroying our lands and fracking these climate bombs. Vaca Muerta is going to consume nearly 10% of the entire global carbon budget that is left. And it's being fracked by German company Wintershall, headquartered in Hamburg and in Kassel. Shell from the Netherlands and England, BP from England, Total from France, Equinor from Norway. It was discovered by Repsol from Spain. So the hand of colonialism is very clear still today, and it's really at the root of the climate crisis. And that's something that I really want to get across in this presentation, and something that the IPCC in the latest report this year has actually acknowledged, that colonialism is at the root of the climate crisis, and it continues to drive the inequality and the crisis farther today for most affected people. So this is something that we need to address. And to finish this introduction, as Cornelius was also telling you, that's when I had to become an activist, and I had contact to some people in government who had access to a report, who told me there was an environmental impact study when the first drilling of fracking wells took place in Mendoza at the end of 2017. And this report was really bad. They were already contaminating the underground water tables. And they decided to hide these results, and they were planning to replace them with fake numbers that they were going to obtain in a university lab. I want to tell you about the role of universities in the corruption and the advancing of the fossil fuel industry globally, but especially in the global south, in a university lab where the vice dean was at the same time a representative of the fracking company. Okay, guys? Any conflict of interest is absolutely clear. And plus, the company was owned by the largest media group in the province. So the conflicts of interest, they were all intertwined. We were fighting the government, the media, the university system that was legitimizing fracking and saying it was totally clean. And so we were able to get a copy of this report before they could, delete it or replace it. And we created a platform called EcoLeaks, inspired by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And without any high technology, we just made a simple website and a Facebook page, because everyone uses Facebook there. And it was amazing. In a few weeks, it became a revolutionary moment. And tens of thousands of people went onto the streets to block the roads, to revolt against the advancing of fracking. This has to do with the history of the area. It has a long environmental history. It's a desert. Mendoza is a place of very famous wines. You may be able to find here in Hamburg Malbec wine from Mendoza, but it's a desert, and people are really aware of the value of water. And fracking really contaminates the water, uses a lot of water. And before I arrived, they were able to ban mega mining, which also does the same, contaminates a lot of water. And that's why I settled in this province, because people really fight for their water when it's threatened. And then I just didn't expect that I would be myself involved in the next wave, which was the anti-fracking fight that we started in 2018. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about fracking, because I assume that most of you already know what it's about. But as I said, I think it's good to start from the general picture to the specifics. And the thing that we must say is that fracking is the greatest example of how far people are willing to go in the name of greed and profit. It's the most insane technique that you could imagine for extracting basins of oil and gas that were priorly unavailable to humanity because they are deeper underground. Conventional reservoirs can be a few hundred meters deep. Shale basins tend to be thousands of meters deep, and they are very difficult to extract because it's a very dense rock. Shale is very dense, and the oil and gas is called unconventional, as opposed to conventional reservoirs where the resources are more freely available. You may have seen the picture, the movies from the old days from Texas, where they would shoot the ground and oil would just, spill out. But in this case, it requires a lot of energy to get this out because it's trapped in the rock very, very deep. And in the late 2000s, you may not know, may not remember, but a few decades ago, there was always this talk about the peak oil moment in time, where humanity was supposed to reach a moment of peak oil production and then supposed to decline. And then the price of oil and gas would go up a lot, energy. And then that would naturally pave the way for renewables to become more and more attractive for investment. But as a last, attempt to extend the lifespan of the fossil fuel industry, that's why fracking was developed. Fracking was developed to extend almost indefinitely the lifespan of the fossil fuel industry at the expense of our survival. That's what fracking is. And it was the combination in the US in the late 2000s, they combined the horizontal drilling with the hydraulic fracturing, which means in order to frack, you need to be able to drill maybe a few thousand meters, like in Vaca Muerta, it's 2,000 or 3,000 meters deep. And then you have to drill horizontally and use enormous amounts of water. You use dynamite to crack the rocks, and then you use a cocktail of 600 chemicals, extremely contaminating, which cause cancer, leukemia. They cause diseases of all the systems of the organism, respiratory, reproductory, nervous systems, animals and humans. It contaminates the air as well, because often underground you have not only what you bring back from the flow back, also brings radioactive materials and heavy metals. So you extract things like radon, which is a gas which gets volatilized and at really low concentrations and really far distances is extremely carcinogenic. So it means the implementation of fracking, it's a death sentence to any community. That's why all of these people that are doing it, they say, not in my backyard. When Donald Trump became president, he put as the Secretary of Energy the CEO of Chevron, right? Or sorry, it was ExxonMobil. And the guy, one of the leading figures of the fracking industry, he actually had a case against fracking because someone tried to do it near his home. And they said, fuck, I don't want this shit. So he actually filed a lawsuit to stop people from fracking. And then when he was interviewed, he said, oh no, I'm all in favor of fracking. I just don't want it to be done near my house. So that's a little bit what's happening also in more general terms in Europe. Europe has been outsourcing fracking, exporting it to us. And all of these multinational companies that cannot do it here, they are sacrificing us to get cheaper oil and gas for you here or for their companies. The Ukraine war has exacerbated all of this, and it means it's doubling down the expansion of fracking everywhere. But this situation was already happening before, and we've been saying this everywhere in Europe for the last few years. I am just happy that now more people are going to talk about it as gas has become a mainstream topic. And it's definitely, I think, the last battleground, the ultimate fossil battleground is gas, which they're telling us is a solution. I'm going to show you it's not. So why is this so important in a global perspective? This is from the US Energy Agency official data that shows the different sources of gas production over the past few decades and going forward to 2040. And as you can see, as the conventional reservoirs of gas and oil, but this one is about gas, are getting depleted over time, shale has come to revolutionize that energy matrix and really extend the lifespan, as I said, from the fossil fuel industry. And as you can see here, the growth of shale gas from the late 2000s and for the next decades is enormous. And if we are going to allow this, This is spelling suicide and spelling doom for all of you, for all of us. For us is today, it will be for you in a couple of years, in a few years. So we all need to come together and work together to stop this. And since you are in an educational institution so important as this one, I think you have a great potential and, if you like, responsibility to help break down this false narrative that somehow this kind of gas is going to be a solution and some kind of energy transition, when I will show you that the carbon footprint of this gas is worse than coal. The shale revolution is what the US called this, and because it revolutionized their capacity and their energy sovereignty. The US was a net importer of energy, and that's why they invaded Iraq. That's why they invaded Afghanistan. That's why they waged so many wars also in the Middle East. So the inception of fracking within the US, which is also sacrificing its own rural populations and especially indigenous communities in the US and Canada, where fracking was first implemented, allowed the US to go from being a net importer of energy to becoming the largest exporter of LNG in the world. They had such a surplus of LNG that they were desperate to export it. And before the war in Ukraine, the shale industry was on its knees. The pandemic and all the oil crisis was made many tens or hundreds of companies to go bankrupt. And the war in Ukraine has been a gift from God to the shale industry. Then you may speculate, because Trump and Putin were quite good friends. And the US is making a killing out of the LNG business that you are importing from them, because Germany went from almost planning no LNG terminals to going to planning a lot of LNG terminals right here, near here. I've been arresting for blocking some of them with Ende Gelände. And I encourage you to do the same, because this is just bullshit. And this graph just shows how it's peaked. You know, the export of LNG, instead of importing, they just, since the inception, the boom of fracking has led the US to become the leader of LNG exports, even ahead of Russia and Qatar. And that's from the US Energy Agency. And so is this. So this is a more generic look at how conventional basins, as I was telling you, over time get depleted, and the unconventionals are taking their space. There is an energy triangle that is not, I didn't put it in this presentation, but the conventional reservoirs are the easiest to extract, but the least abundant. And the bottom of the triangle, the pyramid, shows the opposite, that the unconventional are the hardest to extract, but the most abundant. So needless to say that we need to leave fossil fuels underground, conventional fossil fuels. It should be out of the question that unconventional shale, gas, and oil should never be extracted. Well, the opposite is happening. The governments are going, and the companies, in the exact opposite direction of all the pledges they make on paper, like the Paris Agreement, and especially the Global Methane Pledge, which is a complete lie. So liquefied natural gas, this is just a simplified scheme of how it works. You know, you extract the gas in a gas form, and then in order to transport it to the other side of the world, you need to liquefy it. You don't have a pipeline across the ocean. So they need to compress it 600 times, bringing it down to minus 160 degrees Celsius. And then they load it on these huge transoceanic tankers that are also extremely contaminating, use very heavy fuels to transport this. And in the process, they leak methane through a process called passive cooling that they are forced to release, which adds an additional 20% carbon footprint on the transport alone. And this is the kind of gas that Germany and Europe are getting mostly right now because of the war with Ukraine. And as I was telling you earlier, this is nothing less than speeding toward the abyss. And just so you know, it's not going to be all negative stuff. I'm going to move to positive and hopeful stuff soon. But this is a couple of years old, also from the US Energy Agency, showing the unconventional shale basins around the world. The dark blue were the ones that it's already being developed, and the light blue is the new frontier. This is before Vaca Muerta right now is really getting into full development. But for the last few years, it was just early stage. But you can see, if you can read the amounts of trillions of cubic feet of gas that are available in all of these basins, there's just no way, there's not enough planets to survive on. If we're going to extract all of this, we're not only going to pass the 1.5 or the 2 degrees, we're going to go way above 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. So this is complete insanity. And we need all of you, we need everyone in civil society doing activism, writing papers, questioning the official narratives to break down, to debunk all of these lies before they take us down with them. And this is not a secret, like the BBC here has published some of this, that shale gas has been found to have a worse carbon footprint than coal. So how is it possible that the governments, like right now you have the Greens in government, they know this, but they're telling a lie. And they are selling LNG as a transition fuel, but it's worse than coal. I confronted Habeck directly about this. I confronted Scholz directly about this. They give no answers. Habeck said they want to reduce gas, but of course, all of the governments of Europe are playing by the book of the corporations, because even before the war, you go to the website of Shell, BP, Wintershall, it was them who designed this narrative that LNG is the future of energy and the transition toward renewables. And the governments are simply just putting that into the media and into their mouth. But it couldn't be farther from the truth. There was a groundbreaking paper from a leading global methane expert, Dr. Howard, from the University of Cornell in New York, that revealed in 2019 that fracking has been responsible for more than 50% of all of the increased methane emissions globally from the past decade, or more than 1/3 of the total increase when you took into account all the sources, including biological, more than 50% when it's the fossil fuel industry. But this is huge, considering that over that decade, the methane emissions peaked and boomed at an unprecedented level, and nobody knew why. But he determined that it's been because of the boom in fracking. So what kind of global methane pledge is the EU and the US when they're championing this at Glasgow? Is a total lie. Another study also calculated and estimated the carbon footprint comparing the different fossil fuels. And as you can see, coal here is actually not as bad as shale gas. It's by far the worst of all the fossil fuels in this graph. And methane has a carbon footprint, a global warming potential, which is 87 times higher than CO2 over a 20-year period in the atmosphere. When you take a 100-year period, it goes down to 36. But even that, we don't have 100 years. We need to measure on 20 years. But some of the manipulation has to do with comparing on a 100-year level. But basically, they are not telling the truth. This is the worst fossil fuel of all, and the industry and the governments and the media are selling it to us as something of a solution. And the war has, if anything has come out of this war, is the booming of the LNG global fracking industry. This also from another scientific study. I will send you the PDF with all the references beneath each of the slides. So anyone that wants to do further reading, you can click on them. I will send it to you, Cornelius. And this study also determined, where was the sources of the greatest increases in methane emissions over the recent years. And you can see coal, oil, conventional gas, but by far, almost twice as much as conventional gas, the source has been shale gas. The process of shale, of fracking, is a constant leaking and flaring of methane during the production. It's really expensive to frack. So they are cutting costs everywhere because it takes a lot of energy and water and resources to get all of this oil and gas, which is trapped so far down. So it's really expensive. And when oil and gas are not at really high prices, it's losing money. For the first many years, the US subsidized fracking with 0% interest loans, subsidies, and so on, to allow what they called for energy independence, and what Trump later actually called global energy dominance, American energy dominance. He put it into words. Fracking is nothing less than the energetic branch of American imperialism. Are we going to play into that? And the cognitive dissonance is outstanding. You know, I was shocked to see in COP26 in Glasgow that the US and the EU were leading this global methane pledge, pledging to reduce their methane emissions by 30% by the end of this decade. This was following the IPCC report of that year, which was telling that urgent methane cuts are needed, but the IPCC never mentioned the sources of methane. If you go to the IPCC website, you Google search for fracking or shale, there's almost no mention. And one that you will find is from a few years earlier, and it says that actually fracking has been great for helping reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the US by switching from coal to gas. So they are also totally part of this narrative. I wouldn't just blindly believe in any government institution or intergovernmental panel. We need to build power from the bottom up, and that's what I'm going to show you on the second part of this. But I thought to put these two side by side, because just like Coca-Cola was the sponsor of COP27 until recently because of the scandal, it had to quit. But last in in COP26 in Glasgow, the biggest emitter of methane of the UK, called National Grid, which is a multinational company that also is exporting and importing frack gas from the US, building a frack gas pipeline in Brooklyn, New York. It was found to be spewing methane all over its infrastructure in England, in the UK. And they were one of the biggest sponsors of COP26. So you tell me, what kind of, it's a cognitive dissonance, or they're taking us all for idiots? So as if all of those layers and aspects were not enough, fracking is also intimately connected to the global plastics boom. And we all know how bad plastics is, and plastics are, and how contaminating for the oceans, and what it's meaning for the death of the oceans in the next few years. Well, guess what? The fracking industry, fracking has enabled enormous and unprecedented amounts of ethane to become available at very, very cheap prices, because the shale basins contain a lot of ethane, among other gases. Ethane is the prime raw material for a lot of plastics. So the availability of ethane has led to so many companies going into expanding their plastics infrastructure. In Europe, INEOS is one of the worst. In the US, as you can see here in red, by the time I got this last year, they were planning to expand already plastics production by 30%, with 264 new petrochemical plants. So plastics should be stopping, and it's the opposite. It's expanding. We should be stopping on all of these things, and it's expanding. First of all, we need to have a proper diagnosis and understanding of what's going on. So that's why I want to share all this information with you, with the links below, so that you can do your own research. And as I said already, Vaca Muerta is a major carbon bomb for the planet, but also you have to think not only in terms of climate, but also in terms of what it means for the people that are living there. My personal story is a small case compared to what people are suffering in the global south all over: assassinations, torture, disappearance, constant violations of human rights, displacement of indigenous people. And as you can see in some of these articles, the Mapuche people are the ones that are paying the highest price for the encroached territories with fracking, as they are territories pretty much the same as the territory of Vaca Muerta. And then a couple of years ago, we built this global grassroots coalition that we called Shale Must Fall, inspired by a movement against shale called Shale Must Fall. Shale, obviously, is the same as fracking. And someone from the movement put together this map that is trying to connect. It's by far incomplete, but you can see that everything is connected. So we cannot fight the climate crisis from a just bubble of Europe talk and narrative and perspective. We need to understand the globality of the crisis and where things are coming from, because the destruction of the environment and the destruction of the climate, a lot of it is happening in the global south countries to extract materials that are coming to be consumed in the global north by companies of the global north. So the responsibility is double, and the first step is to understand that, because then we can put pressure on Shell, we can put pressure on Wintershall. Nobody here knows, or in Germany, most people still don't know about Wintershall. It's the biggest fossil fuel company of the biggest economy of Europe. And when I arrived, I came to Hamburg 3 years ago, talked to a group of activists, and they're like, what's Wintershall? We don't know. Well, it's headquartered right here. How come we're not targeting more, bringing it to light even more? I think we really should do a lot more about these companies. So we started bringing groups together. I've always been, since I became an activist, my hope and my faith is put in the grassroots, in the streets level mobilization. I think everything else is important. The academic work is important. The legal work is important. The NGOs that do petitions are important, but none of that will be enough if we don't have power on the streets. If we don't have millions of people mobilizing all over the world, and really striking, with the working class also leading the way, with their powerful strikes stopping the economy, we will not have enough power, because this is no longer a matter of science. It's not about the truth anymore. We know science is on our side. We know the truth is on our side. These people are lying. They know the truth also, but they're funding lies. They're funding fake science, just like the tobacco industry did for decades. And it's a great example if you want to study where they got all these ideas from. It was from the tobacco industry, which lied and financed fake science and information to create the conflict of the people not believing that there is a crisis. Like most of the US, people don't even believe there is a climate crisis. Trump, a president of the most powerful country in the world until recently, denied the climate crisis and continues to do so. So we need to build power from the bottom up. So when I arrived in Germany, I got involved in Ende Gelände, Extinction Rebellion, working with Fridays for Future, and all across Europe. I worked with many groups. We did many blockades, many actions, was arrested many times. And we connected with the thousands that were mobilizing in Vaca Muerta and thousands mobilizing in Africa and in many other places. So we did the first global action a couple of years ago with Ende Gelände, and thousands mobilizing in more than 30 countries to stop the extraction of LNG or fracking and stop this colonialism. Then we did other things like the Global Coastline Rebellion, international solidarity, spontaneous action when the oil spill happened in Peru in February of this year. As a response to that, because it was a European multinational, they didn't want to own up to paying for the cleanup, even for that. So also thousands mobilizing in 20, 30 countries. But you know what? It's always really exciting and really empowering to see so many people from all over the world coming together. But we found that we never have enough power to make a difference. We never have enough power to hold these companies accountable and force them to own up to stopping the fracking or cleaning up the spills. So I'm going to tell you now what we're doing about that, because we think we've come up with something that will solve and help us pave the way to actually make a difference. And before I tell you about that, the last slide I have here is that we need to ground the climate fight. The climate fight is not only about 1.5, about the IPCC, about all of the narratives that are so. Climate fight is the result of the environmental destruction of the countries, especially in the most affected countries, who are now paying the price of all of this exploitation and what the global north has done during its industrialization and the excessive consumption that goes on here. If other countries of the world wanted to live anywhere to the level of waste that is here, because here they don't give you plastic bags, but everything else is plastics. You go buy tomatoes, they come in a beautiful plastic basket with a little handle. Everything you have is a bag, but then at the cashier, they give you a paper bag. Well, it's all ornamental change. It's really that they don't mean to change it, and clearly their lobbies are very powerful. But what I mean to say here is this is just some random picture of a demo somewhere in Europe. And while people in Europe are chanting about all of these things or measuring just the crisis in terms of CO2 emissions and numbers, people in the global south, in most affected countries, they are fighting colonialism. They are deeply in debt, which is forcing the expansion of extractive industries to pay back that debt. That is a colonial tool of oppression. They are suffering fracking, mega mining, deforestation, offshore drilling, which is not allowed here, but they are sending it to us. And they have all of these massive projects, mega carbon bombs like EACOP, Vaca Muerta. They want to frack the Okavango Basin, one of the last wildlife reserve of the world and source of water and life for millions of animals and people. And these are two different realities, but the power to stop it is here as well, because the companies that are doing it, the financiers, the banks, and the governments that are pushing for this are here. And in the global south, we mobilize, but we can be murdered. We are invisible. rarely anything that happens in a global south country makes it into the media of the global north. But here we are in the centers of power. Hamburg, Berlin, Frankfurt, all of these countries of Europe have a lot of power. So there's a lot of power in your hands if we can connect internationally, and if you can help us fight for the global south fights that in the end are fighting for their survival, but also for your survival. If we win our fights, we will start winning one victory at a time, the things we need to win for the climate fight. And in that process, we came up with an unusual and what we think is an out-of-the-box and innovative idea. It's a movement that we have been building for this year that I want to tell you about because it's actually connecting the climate fight with the fight against colonialism. The IPCC, as I told you, reported that colonialism is at the root of the climate crisis this year. And we all know XR, Ende Gelände, Fridays for Future also have been talking about this and becoming anti-colonial, decolonizing ourselves, these self-reflections that are really important, but how do we actually translate that into a concrete action that empowers you to actually stop colonialism? Well, debt. Colonialism today is primarily in the form of debt. Debt that is behind benefiting the multinational companies to extract resources from the global south countries to keep providing to the cycles of consumption of the industrialized world. A few centuries ago, the empires of the times, they would invade you with their armies, including Germany, in Namibia and so on, but mainly the British, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, they invaded you with armies. But later down the road, England perfected a tool of colonialism without needing armies, which is neo-colonialism. Most of Latin America, when we became independent from Spain, we went right into becoming neo-colonies of England. England even helped some of our countries fight the independence wars against Spain. And you know why? The first president of Argentina, Bernardino Rivadavia, a puppet of Britain, in the 1820s signed the first huge fraudulent loan with the Boring Brothers of England. This loan was not paid back until more than a century later, just because we had a president who was crazy enough to understand that he needed to get rid of this debt, because it's not about the capital of the loan, but the interests. If you borrow money, if Germany borrows money, if the US or England borrow money, the interest rates are very low, 1%, 2%, but in the global south, it's usury rates, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So it's unpayable. So the accruing interest on top of the interest becomes a burden that you can never get rid of. And that is a political stranglehold because they need to keep borrowing money to pay back the interest on the old money. And this gets to such extremes that, for example, Nigeria, a few months ago, the cost of paying their debt surpassed their national revenue, guys. So with that, can you tell me, how can anyone expect Nigeria or any of these countries of the global south to have a chance at having an energy transition, a climate mitigation? It's just impossible. Every dollar that we make, 90 cents or 80 cents or all of the dollar goes to pay the debt, which comes back to the coffers of the global north through the international lenders like the IMF, the World Bank. Argentina is also an example of that, and that's why we came up with this idea. Argentina, 20 years ago, was an example to the world of rebelling against the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. It's the classical example of financial colonialism are the IMF and the World Bank. And austerity policies that they always implement, they make you cut social spending, education, privatize healthcare. And so people revolted. And I was there 20 years ago. I was 16, 17 years old. And we ousted the president and the IMF. And it was an example to the world. But now, 20 years later, my country is again in the grips of the IMF, but at record levels, with the biggest debt, the biggest loan in the history of the IMF worldwide, which a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, right-wing President Macri he got in order to help him win the re-election. With pressure from Trump on the IMF, they gave him $44 billion to win the re-election. And luckily he lost, but this was breaking the IMF all own statute. It's totally illegal, illegitimate, as most of this debt is in all these countries. They gave it to dictators. It's never been legitimate, and in any case, it's been paid over many, many times in the interest alone. So what this campaign is about, connecting colonialism and the climate crisis and saying the global South owes trillions of dollars or euros to the global North in financial debt. The global North owes a much larger climate debt. And this climate debt is because of the emissions, but also colonialism and enslavement of much of the world for centuries. So the first step toward paying that climate debt and achieving climate action needs to be cancel the debt of the global South so that that money can be freed to leave trillions of dollars of fossil fuels in the ground by actually financing a just transition. That's the core of the idea. And all of this comes in the context of a global debt crisis in which we are rapidly headed. After the pandemic, all the countries, especially the poor countries, had to borrow even more beyond their means to survive. So now the interest rates are rising, food prices are rising, inflation, things are exploding, and the climate, the debt crisis is set to become an existential threat to the world, and especially to the poorest countries who are already dealing with enough challenges. Needless to say, they cannot afford any climate action because they have to be paying these huge debts. While as I was telling you a little bit, most of the rich countries are responsible for the emissions, while the poorest countries of the world have barely contributed to the climate crisis. We have been the sources of the raw materials, we've been the sources of exploitation, and where the companies are benefiting on the global North countries, but we are paying the largest part of the climate crisis today. For us, it's not a future thing, it's happening now. And people who are brave enough to defend their land are simply assassinated. There is no security. Because of enslavement and colonialism, the global North also owes reparations. And this is one of the many demands that also we support from the movement that we're building, Debt for Climate. Reparations are owed, loss and damage must be paid, as was one of the breakthroughs at COP27. But we still don't know how much they're going to put into the fund. And we don't know how much they will really fulfill it if it's not just for the picture, for show. When before they put into place this climate finance that they were committing to provide 100 billion euros a year for poor countries, they were not even fulfilling that. And they were doing it in the form of more debt, interest debt. So giving us help by giving us more debt is helping them, is not helping us. And the loss and damage, some of what I heard is they also are intending to give some of this in the form of debt. And even if they don't, the amounts will never be enough. A few billion will never be enough to make up for what we need the money. But even more, loss and damage is really important. But if first you don't cancel the debt, you give this money to Nigeria, let's say, and they are having to pay most of their money to the debt they owe. So what do you think is going to happen? Most of the loss and damage that you give a country is going to go right back out to pay the interest on the debt. So it's like putting water in a bucket full of holes. We need to fix the holes, cancel the debt, and then pay loss and damage as well and reparations. This is what I was telling you already about climate finance, which also makes it look like the Global South is begging and receiving a gift from the great saviors of the Global North. And what Debt for Climate really is also is a strategic coming together. It's a strategic campaign because we realize that it's not enough. We don't have enough power in the climate movement alone. The climate movement, especially in Europe, is a bubble. XR, Fridays, Ende Gelände, and other movements, we are in a bubble. And it's a very middle class, the criticism is very middle class, privilege. And some of it is true, and it's been hard to connect with the working class, which is the people that should be the protagonists of this fight. And for many reasons, it's difficult. But by tackling the debt, we have found a way to start building bridges with social justice movements, with the workers of the Global South, with the indigenous movements, because they all understand very well the impact that debt has on their lives. The workers of the Global South, when you talk to them about the climate crisis, you get a similar answer than here. It's like, well, we have more urgent problems. We are fighting today for our food, our job, our safety, our education for the children, and so on. And we understand that's a problem, but it's not our immediate problem. But you know what is one immediate problem for them? The debt. Because every dollar that the country makes has to pay 80 cents of every dollar. Is that money gets out of the pockets of the workers. So the workers understand, and because of that, we've been able to mobilize thousands and thousands of workers from the Global South in the actions we have done so far of Debt for Climate. And it's a bridge that we are building at a time when we see the opposite is happening in Europe. The climate movement is getting antagonized from the working class. The media, the governments, especially the populist right-wingers, are going to try to blame the financial crisis which is coming and anything that is happening on the climate activists. And so they're going to tell the workers, you cannot feed your family because these guys are blocking the pipeline that we need to build to create progress and development. So that's a very dangerous, if they get away with that, we are doomed. We need to build alternative narratives of solidarity, international solidarity. That's where Debt for Climate will not be the only one, but it's a formidable tool that is bringing together feminist movements. This Friday, by the way, we have an amazing webinar at 7 p.m. German time with Silvia Federici, people from the Ni Una Menos movement in Argentina, global feminist figures, to talk precisely about Debt for Climate and the impact of debt on the women and women's movements. I was telling you about the indigenous movements who were the first to be plundered by this extraction, and now they are lending the money that they extracted from us. So they stole them all of this wealth from the Global South colonizing us, and now they lend it to us and they colonize us again. We have to pay them for what they supposedly lent us, which they stole from us. It's a very perverse cycle, and Debt for Climate is giving activists a clear narrative and a clear way where you have power, because we can turn debt into climate action, and debt is actually the lowest hanging fruit for climate action. Trillions of dollars of fossil fuels can be kept in the ground if you can cancel these trillions of dollars that are owed by the Global South. It will not be as simple as that. What it will take is a really powerful movement of workers, climate, social, indigenous, and feminist movements working together also within the Global South to put pressure on our corrupt governments to do the right thing and actually finance a truly just transition that is led by the people and not by the corporations that usually are the ones that are really governing us through our authorities. For that, we are inspired by Thomas Sankara, who was assassinated 35 years ago this year. He was an anti-colonial leader from Burkina Faso who called for creating a global front against debt, a united front of Global South countries against debt. He was killed because of that a few weeks after that speech. And he said, I will not be alive next year in the next meeting if we don't create this front, because one country alone, one leader alone cannot do it. That's why we need to build a global movement from the bottom up, where the workers need to be not the antagonists, but the protagonists of this. And I already told you about multinational companies. So all of this debt colonialism is truly benefiting them, who are getting the best deals and the new extraction sources to get more oil and gas, which is the main interest of this meeting, but also other materials, also lithium for the green future of Europe, is all going to be paid for by us. And an extraction is a cycle of debt and extraction, and you have to get more and more resources to always keep paying this debt that is impossible to pay back. That's why we need a united front. And on the other hand, you have the people who extracted the wealth in the first place and lent you the money, and they're using that as a perfect game of self-benefit and self-enrichment. And as I said earlier, all of this has deadly consequences today and in the future for you as well. People are dying by the thousands already because of the climate crisis, and people are dying by the thousands being killed by confronting this. Latin America has the highest murder rate of environmental defenders of any region in the world. In the last few years, more than 1,200 environmental defenders have been killed, especially in the Amazon, where they are the front lines against mega mining, deforestation. And then you have examples like my case, which compared to that is nothing, but they use persecution, they use a corrupt justice system to create criminal cases against us. That's why we need you here, because here we can do activism without getting murdered, without getting tortured. So we need to be able to use the voices we have here to amplify the invisible struggles that are taking place at the front lines of the climate crisis now, which are against the companies from here and the banks from here and the debt colonialism that is also mostly from here. Germany has the 4th largest voting power in the IMF, and Germany owes its economic miracle after the war partly to debt cancellation. Few people seem to know this, but the debt of the Nazis, who caused the Holocaust and the worst war in world history, was canceled to prevent Germany from falling into communism after the war. So if they were able to cancel the debt of the Nazis, they can definitely cancel the debt of the Global South to enable a just transition. That shows that it can be done, that it can be successful. Germany became an economic powerhouse. And guess what? Our next global action is going to be about that, because February 27th next year, so 2 months from now, is the 70th anniversary of that event, of the debt cancellation of Germany. So we want to use that as an opportunity to cast light on how it's possible, how it can lead to great results, and how it must be done morally. It should be an obligation to do that. And Germany can and should be leading by example. So, as I already said many times, canceling this debt can enable unprecedented climate action, and in the process, we can build a powerful movement that actually brings millions of people together around the world to change the balance of power and change the political agendas in the Global South and North. And this is not a request of kindness or charity or goodwill, but justice. As I already said, the Global North climate debt is an order of magnitude higher than our financial debts, which are mostly illegitimate. And that's how we can build a global movement that actually will give us the power to enable debt cancellation in the coming years for the climate fight. This is a picture from the global action. And I will just show you now a brief video from the first action we did, which was in June. The G7 was meeting in Germany. That video, but I think this will explain things better than I can. Let's see if it works.
Latina, desde el sur global levantamos nuestras voces para decir que se anulen las deudas financieras ilegítimas que empobrecen a nuestros pueblos.
Para exigir que la deuda del sur sea anulada.
And we have found a way that we can connect the workers with the climate and social movements of the world. It's up to us to lead the transition. The IMF and the World Bank, they are keeping our countries in the Global South in so much debt that we are forced to keep expanding the fossil fuel industry just to keep up paying the interest on the loans.
System change, not climate change. System change, not climate change.
The IMF is wielding its power as a creditor to push for further fossil fuel extraction by US and Europe companies.
La Argentina es un caso de cómo el FMI impone un préstamo récord de 44.000 millones de dólares.
Su enriquecimiento particular y de sus empresas a expensa de la destrucción de la naturaleza y de la vida social.
Because of this debt, our country can't take real action for climate. Sri Lankan people deserve decent lives. We deserve to live in an environment that is safe for our animals, our biodiversity, and our ecosystem, and our people.
We want to implement a just transition in the developing world. We want to end climate change.
And the Global North has the largest climate debts.
Le progrès, la richesse, le développement des pays développés et riches actuellement, c'est fait sur l'exploitation de notre terre-mère et sur l'exploitation et le génocide de nos peuples.
Es por todo esto que este es un llamado urgente a todos los trabajadores y movimientos ambientales del norte global a unirnos.
The countries in the G7 have built their wealth on the purposeful underdevelopment of the global south.
G7, we want justice for colonialism. We are tired.
Il est inacceptable que notre population continue à souffrir, continue à payer un lourd tribut à cause des dettes qui ont été contractées par le Belge lors de l'époque coloniale.
World Bank, take the knee off the neck of the global south.
One of the richest countries in the world, India became one of the poorest. Between 1765 and 1938, Britain drained a total of $45 trillion.
Por eso la importancia, compañeros, de unirnos en organizaciones con el protagonismo de los trabajadores en esta lucha ambiental de América Latina, de África, de Europa, de Estados Unidos, del sudeste asiático, con un único lema: la deuda es con los pueblos y con la naturaleza.
Cancel the debt now.
La deuda es con el pueblo y la naturaleza.
Turn debt into climate action.
Turn debt into climate action.
Turn debt into climate action. Climate justice now.
Queremos justicia climática.
This is only the start of a campaign, multi-year campaign, to hold the global north accountable for its climate obligations to the global south.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope it wasn't too dense.
Yes, thank you, Esteban, for this presentation. That gave me goosebumps on some parts, I have to say. Are there any questions you might have? You can, ihr könnt die auch auf Deutsch stellen. Ich gebe mein Bestes, zu übersetzen. Any questions in the room? Or maybe in the Zoom chat? Okay.
Also als beginnende Frage vielleicht im Chat. So, in the Zoom chat, they asked at what time this speech of Silvia Federici on Friday. Where is it? At what time?
Yes, it's at 7 p.m. on Friday, and you can find I can also give you, I'll leave my contact here so anyone can just get my number and I can send it to you directly on Signal or WhatsApp. But you can also find it on Twitter or Instagram. Just go to @DebtForClimate. And it's actually on Twitter, is for sure pinned at the top of the profile. So you can find it. There's the Zoom link there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I also have a question. Because you've mentioned the COP, and we have also seen it in the video, the next COP. I was wondering, because last week we had our fellow activists here who had an input and told, like, recaptured what they did in Egypt. And I was wondering, because you were criticizing the COP because it's just for show and the biggest sponsor are more likely to be the biggest environmental criminal. Why should we just still go there and try to convince people that they are doing a bad job? And maybe also I was wondering, because is it not also a signal to the climate activists to put them in danger, not just in Egypt but also in Qatar next year, next time? It's maybe also a signal to activists that they should stay in their lane, and also maybe the white activists to show them who is, in charge. Do you have
Yeah, no, very important points. The last one, I think that's their goal, to make us feel powerless, to make us give up. to make us feel that, you know, you're not going to go to Egypt and risk your life, or maybe a handful of people will be able to and willing to do that. Same in Qatar. So they're doing that at the most critical time, when we should be pushing the most, and when we were getting a little more disruptive and dangerous, and now we have the war and so many rollbacks back into coal, and now the LNG terminals everywhere. So they're really emboldened, I think, the fossil fuel industry, which is behind the same people that are organizing COP. And, you know, it's not some, I think some people in Europe have this illusion of division of power and institutions and all of this shit that they've been feeding us down the throat, and that we should be aspired to be like that. But it's not like that. The way power works is universal. The fossil fuel industry and the banks are playing Scholz, are playing COP, are playing the British government and all the others like a piano. And I think what we need to do is not give up. The COP, just like this university, I see them as spaces of dispute, to dispute power. We must not just, okay, we tried, like a lot of movements in recent months were quite, like I went to do some talks and the feeling was like, well, we tried and we failed. No, you can't do that. In the global south, it's not an option. You know, we never give up. We have to fight because it's a survival fight. So I think people in Europe maybe also, there is a need to understand that more, that it's not a hobby, but it's a survival fight. And that's also why it needs to be a working class fight. Our job should be to, how can we convey that to the workers more, the best we can, because we know that this is a working class fight, because the workers of here, the global north and south, are the ones that are going to pay the highest price. They just don't know it yet here, maybe. But we know they will be fighting this fight when there's no more food, no more jobs, no more water. But we know they have the power. You know, if they stop the trains, the supply chains, and everything stops, the government has to negotiate with them. They have the real power, because it resides, the power is in they're united, they are unionized. So I think we need to crack our heads. We're all, people here, academics as well, find new ways to talk to the working class. The million-dollar question is, how can the working class become the protagonist of this fight now? Not in 2032, but today. And you had a first question that I don't remember. You, besides COP, I think we should dispute the spaces of COP, but I think you asked one more thing that I forgot.
Well, I have also another question, which is also quite fitting right now, because I was wondering, how would you start a conversation with someone working at the port, at the new LNG terminals? Because I think, because I read an interview about an activist who was gluing themselves to the streets, and she said, I will never do it again because I don't stand for it anymore. It's because of the hate I got. And I was wondering, how would you do it? Like,
yeah. You approach it strategically. And one criticism I have of all universities, I was in the US, the university system is disgusting, guys, disgusting. Another day we can talk more if you want about that, but they're not teaching us to think strategically. Nobody's teaching us how to deal. The kind of skills that we need to be able to deal with the climate crisis are not the skills we are learning in university. In university, you can learn the science, you can learn the technical stuff that is really necessary as well, but nobody's teaching you strategy. Nobody's teaching you how power works. And what we need to recognize is that there are people who are a small minority of the world who are literally waging war on humanity and life on the planet. And because Shell, BP, all of these people know the truth, and they're financing false science, they're financing right-wing groups to undermine democracies. They're behind Trump in the US. Greenpeace published an article on that as well. They're funding all the things that are wrong, and they're waging war on us. But we're not going to win it if our response is just tell the truth. Because it's not about the truth. It's not about science. It's about power. And power doesn't give up itself voluntarily unless we have a strategy. No war was ever won without a strategy. So I would like to, it's hard for the climate movement because here it came out of the peace movement. So they don't like to think in those terms. Well, fuck it, you have to. So I would really recommend a book to all of you that is The Art of War, written thousands of years ago by a great thinker, the brightest military mind of all time, in my opinion, Sun Tzu from China. It's a masterpiece, and it's not about war only. It's so genius that it's taught in business, it's taught in sports, it's taught in Harvard, it's taught in the biggest institutions of the world where strategic minds are being trained for anything, because the strategy is about two different forces against each other, the dynamics of power. That's what we don't learn in university, but we need to educate ourselves with. So my answer is, I wouldn't approach that worker first. I would start with the workers that are most receptive to the message. And that's why we start with the workers of the Global South, because we found this gold mine of talking about debt that they can understand and relate to so intimately. So if we mobilize, imagine that in a few months or years, we can mobilize millions of workers around the world. And I think just like what happened with Fridays for Future, nobody expected, Greta was striking in the parliament in Sweden, and then you have a global movement. It changes the common sense, it changes the perspectives. The situation is totally different. So I think if we have a new momentum where workers around the world are taking the protagonism, workers here will also start to, a lot of workers want to do something for the climate, but they just don't want to be doing this at their own expense, sacrificing their job and their livelihood. And that's reasonable, guys. So they are portraying the climate movement as being against their jobs, against the workers. But with a campaign like this, the reason is a strategic approach also for here we have a movement or a campaign that doesn't target you. You can support this, and you will be fighting with us together against the same enemies, the same villains that are exploiting you here and exploiting us there, which is the top 1%, the financial power and colonialism. So this doesn't affect them directly. And then maybe I wouldn't start with the poor worker, I would start with the teachers' unions, the ones that are the most progressive, the ones that have the most international solidarity sensitivities, the ones that usually have the least power but will be more receptive to us, and then slowly build a broader coalition and build a momentum and a wave where even the port workers will be like, well, yeah, I'm not agreeing that they're going to affect my job, but I agree to cancel the debt. And at least that's what we are trying to do. It will not solve, it's not perfect, and it will not answer all the questions, but it is undeniably, it's a strategic approach. And I think we just need to discuss strategy, guys. I think there's a total lack of strategy thinking in the climate movement. And the more we can discuss these things, the better. It's only that way we will get anywhere. Because the other guys are really organized, and they have the best strategists in the world and the best marketing experts in the world. And we are here like fight for 1.5, I'm not putting down 1.5 or Fridays for Future, but I work with them. It's just not enough. We need to do more.
All right. Are there any other questions in the room, or maybe reactions even? I'm sure there's a diversity of thought on the role of power and war in this. Or any other questions? Yes. I'll walk up and you can talk into the microphone.
It's not a question, but like a small correction. You said several times because war of Ukraine, but it would be more correctly to say because of Russians war in Ukraine, against Ukraine, because it's not only Ukraine, but also it's the whole world who is suffering because of that. Thank you.
Yeah, you're totally right. The war is not, Ukraine is not waging this war. It's a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yes. Yeah.
All right. And I think we have one question in the Zoom room.
I have one in English and one I have to translate first, but I'm not good enough in English to translate it as I read it. So first, the English one. How does the movement want to ensure that the cancer debt is turned into climate actions? And does it just make corrupt governments more powerful?
Excellent question. That's the $1 trillion question. And that's why we should have no illusions that the debt cancellation will not be a magic wipe out of the debt and suddenly becomes climate action if we don't have a powerful movement that can enforce it. We need to have that. But we also know the debt will not be canceled at any significant level until and unless we have that powerful movement. So it's a process of just building power from the bottom up. Right now, the balance of power, is really uneven. You have all the power concentrated in the fossil fuel companies, the financial power, and then on the other side of the scale, you have billions of people whose present and future are at stake, but they're not united. They're not united fighting together. Our power is in our numbers, but only if we can unite. So if we can unite enough people behind this common goal, and the coalition of workers and climate and feminists and indigenous movements working together, they need to make sure that our countries of the Global South cannot just do whatever they want. The same power of striking and stopping an economy that led us to cancel the debt is going to be the same power that is going to allow us to have those negotiations where the Green New Deal, or whatever you want to call it, is determined for each country. But that has to be determined by the country itself. It cannot be told by Germany or England or the IMF. It has to be a self-determined just transition, but it will only be a truly just transition if we have the power to make it happen. We understand, we have no illusions, nothing will be a gift. This is a power struggle, and we will not achieve any of this until we build that power. That's why it's what this campaign, this movement is all about. Explicitly, build power so that we can counter the other side of the power.
Thank you. Before we take the other question of the Zoom room, is there any other question in the room? Otherwise, we've worked out the translation, or rather DeepL has.
Yeah.
The German Development Loan Corporation, as one of the most important state banks, has just announced that they will completely...
The German what?
Sorry. The German Development Loan Corporation, KfW in German, KfW. We can maybe look up the correct term. As one of the most important state banks, has just announced that they will completely ignore the 1.5-degree target for 2 years in order to invest in LNG projects worldwide. What do you think we students can stand up against such fatal decisions? So I will look up the bank afterwards, but I think the question is about the role of students in a university in the fight, which, I mean, you've touched on previously. But
yeah, no, I think you have a huge potential for first to cast light on all of these things, because financial stuff is difficult for people. It's one reason the financial world gets to do whatever they want, is that it's difficult for people to understand what's going on. And what we are doing with the movement is also to simplify the situation. Debt for Climate is simplifying a complex financial topic into something that is very clear. This is, the debt leads to extraction of fossil fuels and benefiting is colonialism and so on. So I think Fridays for Future, students in general have a lot of power, because if they cast light on this bank or the ECB or the Bundesbank or the IMF or the World Bank, where Germany plays a central role, it would make a huge difference, because the general public will talk more about it. Like, for example, Fridays for Future still has a huge media impact. And if they just were to target some of these banks, a lot of people and the mainstream media would have to start talking about it. And they don't talk about it when other groups necessarily, like when we did the Ende Gelände camp this year in Hamburg, there were 5 cameras at the press conference. There was thousands of people in this camp, a lot of movements, Global South people brought here. 5 cameras I saw in the press conference. No media coverage. The year before, we were arrested blocking the Nord-Ostsee Canal, the busiest canal in the world. No media coverage. So I think you have a lot of power as students, as Fridays for Future, that if you cast light on these financial criminals, it will help everyone. It will help us as well to talk more about debt. We need to get the general public to talk more about these things, because I think this is the path, the best path we can find for climate action is targeting debt and targeting financial colonialism.
We've looked up the KfW is a German state-owned investment and development bank based in Frankfurt. Yes. one of the key people is Robert Habeck. Yes.
Nice. Would you send it to me later? It'd be nice.
I will, and we also have to fact check. It was just a comment in the chat. We don't know whether it's true. As with everything, we will try to found it with sources. You know what I mean. All right. Any other questions in the room? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Hey, thank you for the lecture. And you said that the Debt for Climate is a good way to mobilize the working class in the global south. But I imagine that here in the global north, it's likely to be more of an antagonizing issue for the working class, as they would feel like they are the ones who have to pay up. So how would you frame the issue here, or would you somehow change the framing completely to get people on board and then start talking about this? Or yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a key question, and we don't have all the answers. We are trying and trying and trying, and I think I invite all of you to think with us. And if you can come up with better ways, we need everyone to think. We don't have all the answers, but one thing is that a lot of labor unions and workers, they want to do something for the climate, as I said earlier, but they don't want to do it shooting themselves on the foot. So with this campaign, we're telling them, you can do something for the climate. You have a lot of power to change this, and it will not affect your job directly. It will not undermine your livelihood. We are fighting the same financial power and top 1% of the same people that are profiting from you, they're profiting from us. It was also revealed that 130 billionaires have the same carbon footprint than all of France, recently in an Oxfam report. So clearly there is a very disproportionate carbon footprint. The working class is not the one responsible for most of it. So all of these things, I think, are part of the narrative, and maybe they're not ideal. The best would be, here's the revolutionary narrative that you can lead the way, but at least it's something that there's not many options for the workers in Europe to do something for the climate fight without feeling that they have to pay for it, like against their own interests. So Debt for Climate is one way. It will not be the only way, but it's something we found that can help us find narratives like that.
All right. Any other questions online or here? Otherwise, I might have a question. Something I've heard from people is, you have to differentiate. There's different ways of fracking, of extracting from the shale, and that some are more harmful than others. I don't know if it's your expertise, but maybe you can shed some, I'd say, like scientific light on are there different types of fracking, and are there ones that you think could be considered not harmful? I mean, I probably know the answer already, but yes, that might be a question to you.
Yeah, what they're talking about usually is some greenwashing narratives that they're trying to call fracking something good, like they say conventional fracking versus unconventional fracking, which they use conventional fracking in some places where unconventional fracking is not allowed, and is normally used to help permeabilize the rock at the end of it's conventional, so it's a conventional basin, not what I showed you here. So it doesn't use all of those chemicals and all of those destructive things. And it's usually when the conventional reservoir is getting empty, it helps, it's also like scratching the end of the pot by helping permeabilize the rock a little more and get a little more out. That's what it means, and that's what some people talk about that. But it's definitely not what globally fracking is understood to be, which is the combination of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, which is what I was focusing on today and what was developed in the late 2000s, because the conventional fracking has been around for decades. So they also used that against us in Vaca Muerta. The governor, when they brought fracking to Mendoza, they were like, oh, this technique has been around since the 50s. It's nothing new, guys. It's, of course, a total lie. But they were trying to use that kind of a narrative against us. It's just something the industry has created to confuse people. In England as well, they banned fracking, but then the industry was trying to do fracking under different names. It's a cat and mouse game, and they have a lot of money to invent new terms and put them in the media,
So if I understood right, it's, for example, the unconventional fracking that is interfering with like groundwater supplies, for example, in Vaca Muerta, when you have to go horizontal and everything.
Yes, what did you say at the beginning?
The unconventional fracking is what is interfering with groundwater supplies, for example.
Right. Well, conventional can also, because it can be quite deep, but the most dangerous and toxic is the unconventional fracking because of the 600 chemicals that are used to break the rock and keep the pores open and all of that. So by far the most suicidal technique is the unconventional fracking. That's why it's not allowed here. Although now they are talking about it because they are so desperate for gas, but you know, the local populations are really against it for good reasons. But here they were able to stop it. They're just sending it to us.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question concerning the shale revolution. Could you switch to the slide in the presentation?
1 second.
The one with this statistic.
Let me see. Wait, that's a challenge. How do I go back to the... I'll just close the video, okay? And then... There you go. Thank you.
Which slide again?
The shale revolution.
Yes. Yeah, no, the next one. Yes, because you said that the Russian invasion has caused.
Is it possible to speak a little louder?
Sorry. You said that the Russian invasion caused an export boom, but the time shown in the stat is like before the Russian invasion. So I wanted to, maybe I lost track or so, but could you repeat what the cause for this peak has been?
Yes, no, it's good that you asked that because this graph is from before the invasion. As I was saying, the trend was already, the US was already becoming the largest exporter of LNG before the invasion of Ukraine. This has to be very clear. But since the invasion of Ukraine, it has exploded. I don't know if there is an updated graph from the Energy Agency of the US. I'm not checking them every week. But I bet you if we get an update of this graph in the new report for this year, we're probably going to see an even greater growth of the red line here of the exports because they have an enormous amount of gas. They were really pushing to get it out. You know, when Merkel was in power, she was rejecting the LNG terminals. And how did Trump change? He bent her arm. I don't know if you say that in English, but and the reason how he did it is he threatened to put taxes and tariffs on the car manufacturing of Germany, so that the car industry would go to England after Brexit. So they were really pushing for getting the gas into the markets of Europe because they have too much of it and they didn't have a market to put it on. The invasion of Ukraine has been, among other things, something that they have taken advantage of to just supply. Now there's not enough gas. Everyone here needs gas. They have to get it from the US, from Argentina, from Africa, from anywhere they can. That's why Scholz and Habeck went to the Arab states, to Qatar, and so on to try to make deals to get enough gas. But this was the trend already before. That's what I meant to say. And since then, it has exploded even more.
All right. So if there's no questions online left, I think you might be dismissed early today. Thank you, Esteban, for your talk.
Thank you so much. And it'd be great to see you at the webinar. It's going to be really cool. And it'd be great to see you in the Global Action in February 27th. We're probably going to do things in many cities. So get in touch if you want. I can... are you in touch with everyone? Can you give them my number and my email and the email of Debt for Climate? So we need all of you so we can have more power here. Thank you.
Bring yourselves and a few friends. Thank you.